The rain drummed against the windows of 21 Army Group headquarters in London, as General Bernard Montgomery spread the classified maps across the oak table. It was March 15, 1944, and the weight of Europe's liberation rested on the shoulders of men gathered in smoke-filled rooms like this one. The hook that would pull Nazi Germany from its Atlantic fortress was about to be cast, but first, it needed to be forged with meticulous precision. Gentlemen, Montgomery's clipped voice cut through the tension. What we discuss here today will determine whether our boys come home as heroes, or don't come home at all. The British general's steely gaze swept across the assembled planners, each man representing months of intelligence gathering, strategic analysis, and sleepless nights. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had arrived earlier that morning, his usual diplomatic smile replaced by the grave expression of a man who understood that history would judge every decision made in these crucial weeks. The American general had spent the previous evening reviewing casualty estimates that made even seasoned veterans pale. Operation Overlord, as the massive cross-channel invasion had been codenamed, represented the largest amphibious assault in human history. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder leaned forward, his finger tracing the Normandy coastline on the detailed reconnaissance photographs. The Luftwaffe's strength continues to diminish, he reported, but Rommel's been busy. Our latest intelligence suggests he's overseen the installation of over 4 million mines along the Atlantic Wall. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence for thousands of young soldiers who would soon storm those beaches. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, studied the proposed landing zones with the intensity of a chess master contemplating his opening moves. Utah Beach and Omaha Beach would be America's primary responsibility, while the British and Canadians would assault Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. Each sector presented unique challenges that kept the planners awake at night. The deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, had been running for months under the direction of the London Controlling Section. Double agents fed false information to German intelligence, suggesting the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. General George Patton, arguably America's most recognizable combat commander, had been placed in command of a fictitious 1st United States Army Group, complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic. Colonel David Strangeways, the British deception specialist, whose work would later be chronicled in various intelligence histories, including those found in the National Archives, outlined the intricate web of lies designed to keep German reserves away from Normandy. We've convinced them that Overlord is merely a feint, he explained, and that the real invasion will come weeks later at Calais. Weather dominated every conversation. Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, had become perhaps the most important man in the room. His forecasts would determine not just the success of the operation, but the lives of over 150,000 Allied troops. The invasion required specific conditions: a low tide to expose German obstacles, sufficient moonlight for paratroopers, and calm seas for the landing craft. As the meeting concluded, each officer carried with him a piece of the enormous puzzle. The target date remained fluid, dependent on weather, tides, and moon phases. But one thing was certain: the liberation of Western Europe would begin with the largest gamble in military history, and failure was not an option. The thunder of aircraft engines filled the English countryside as the massive military machine prepared for Operation Overlord. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Southwick House, Portsmouth, the planning had evolved from theoretical discussions to concrete preparations. It was April 20th, 1944, and the invasion force was taking shape with industrial precision. General Eisenhower stood before a wall-sized map of Nazi-occupied Europe, red pins marking German divisions, blue pins showing Allied forces. The Supreme Commander had spent the previous week visiting training camps across southern England, watching young soldiers practice amphibious landings on beaches that bore haunting similarities to those they would soon assault for real. Major General Percy Hobart's specialized armor units, known as Hobart's Funnies, were completing final trials. These modified tanks included swimming Sherman DD tanks with flotation screens, Churchill-Aver tanks equipped with mortars for destroying fortifications, and flail tanks designed to clear minefields. Each innovation represented months of engineering work and could mean the difference between success and catastrophe on the beaches. The logistics challenge dwarfed anything previously attempted in warfare. Rear Admiral Bertram Ramsay, naval commander for Neptune, the naval component of Overlord, coordinated a fleet of over 5,000 vessels. Transport ships, landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, and battleships would ferry the invasion force across the channel, while providing massive fire support against German coastal defenses. Colonel James Earl Rudder had been selected to lead the 2nd Ranger Battalion in perhaps the most dangerous mission of D-Day, scaling the 100-foot cliffs at Point Du Hoc to destroy German guns threatening both Utah and Omaha beaches. His men trained on the cliffs of Devon, using rope ladders and grappling hooks under live-fire conditions. That simulated the hell they would face. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly complex picture of German defenses. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had transformed the Atlantic Wall from propaganda into reality, installing deadly obstacles on every potential landing beach. Czech hedgehogs, Belgian gates, and Rommel's asparagus covered the tidal zones, while concrete bunkers housing everything from machine guns to massive artillery pieces commanded overlapping fields of fire. The German command structure presented both opportunities and challenges for Allied planners. Adolf Hitler maintained personal control over strategic reserves, often refusing to release divisions even when field commanders desperately needed reinforcements. This centralized decision-making could work in the Allies' favor if they could establish their beachhead before German reserves arrived. Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory commanded the largest air armada ever assembled. Over 13,000 aircraft would support the invasion, from transport planes carrying paratroopers to heavy bombers targeting coastal defenses. The pre-invasion bombing campaign, known as the Transportation Plan, aimed to cripple German logistics by destroying bridges, rail yards, and communication centers throughout northern France. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway prepared his 6th Airborne Division for that crucial mission, securing the eastern flank of the invasion by capturing key bridges and destroying the Merville Battery. His paratroopers would jump in darkness, hours before the beach assaults, operating behind enemy lines with minimal support until seaborne forces linked up with them. The human cost weighed heavily on every commander. Medical units prepared for massive casualties, with hospital ships positioned offshore and aid stations established throughout southern England. Casualty estimates for the first day ranged from 10,000 to over 20,000 men, numbers that represented not statistics but sons, husbands, and fathers who might not return home. Psychological warfare joined the military preparations. Allied radio broadcasts to occupied France increased in frequency, while resistance networks received coded messages through the BBC. The French underground, coordinated by the Special Operations Executive, prepared to launch coordinated sabotage operations to disrupt German communications and transportation. As spring turned toward summer, the invasion force reached peak readiness. Sealed camps housed assault troops, preventing security breaches, while final briefings revealed actual objectives. The greatest military secret of the war remained intact, but time was running short. Weather windows, tide tables, and moon phases dictated that the invasion must come soon, or wait another month. In Hitler's fortress Europe, the defenders waited, unaware that liberation was approaching with the power of industrial democracy behind it. The weather forecast delivered to Supreme Headquarters on June 1, 1944, struck the assembled commanders like a physical blow. Group Captain James Stagg, his face grave with responsibility, reported deteriorating conditions across the English Channel. High winds, heavy seas, and low cloud cover threatened to transform Operation Overlord from liberation into catastrophe. General Eisenhower sat at the head of the conference table in Southwick House, the weight of command etched in every line of his face. The provisional date of June 5th loomed just days away, with over 150,000 troops already sealed in their assembly areas. Some landing craft had already departed from distant ports, their seasick crews enduring rough seas. While awaiting final orders, the meteorological situation presents us with an impossible choice. Stagg continued, his Scottish accent lending gravity to words that could alter the course of history. Current conditions would prevent effective air support, make naval gunfire inaccurate, and create sea states that could swamp our smaller landing craft. The silence that followed was broken only by rain against the windows. Admiral Ramsay leaned forward, his weathered face reflecting decades of naval experience. We've committed forces that cannot simply be recalled and repositioned without enormous logistical complications, he stated. Some convoys are already at sea, and turning them back now would create impossible harbor congestion. The naval commanders' concerns reflected the massive scale of Operation Neptune. with vessels from every allied nation participating in the cross-channel assault. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory voiced the concerns of the allied air forces. Without clear skies, we cannot provide the close air support our ground forces will desperately need. The preliminary bombing of coastal defenses would be largely ineffective, leaving our boys to face intact German positions. His words carried particular weight, as air superiority had become fundamental to Allied military doctrine. Montgomery, ever the confident field commander, argued for maintaining the June 5th schedule despite the weather concerns. Delay increases the risk of discovery, he insisted. German intelligence may uncover our preparations, and Rommel continued strengthening the Atlantic Wall daily. Every day we wait gives the enemy additional time to prepare. The British general's aggressive stance reflected his belief that momentum was crucial in military operations. General Bradley presented the American perspective with characteristic pragmatism. My boys have trained for months for this moment, he said quietly. They're as ready as they'll ever be, but they need every advantage we can give them. Sending them ashore in a storm, without air cover, against intact defenses would be tantamount to murder. His words resonated with commanders who had seen too many young men die in poorly planned operations. The intelligence picture complicated the decision further. Ultra intercepts revealed German confusion about Allied intentions, with some commanders convinced the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, while others suspected Normandy. This strategic ambiguity represented months of deception work that might be wasted if delays allowed German intelligence to penetrate Allied security. Colonel Strangeways reported on Operation Fortitude's continued success in deceiving German intelligence. Our double agents continue feeding information suggesting Patton's fictitious army group will launch the main attack at Calais, he explained, but prolonged delays risk exposing the deception, potentially drawing German reserves to Normandy. The delicate web of lies required perfect timing to maintain effectiveness. Eisenhower requested updated casualty estimates based on various weather scenarios. The numbers presented by medical planners painted a sobering picture. Good weather might result in 10,000 casualties on the first day, while poor conditions could double or triple that figure. Each number represented a human life, a reality that weighed heavily on every commander present. The discussion turned to alternative dates. Tidal conditions suitable for the invasion occurred only briefly each month, and the next opportunity wouldn't arrive until mid-June. However, waiting that long would compress the campaign season, potentially forcing winter fighting that could bog down in conditions reminiscent of the Western Front during the First World War. German defensive preparations added urgency to the decision. Rommel's inspection tours had accelerated fortification construction along the Norman coast. Intelligence reports, later verified in post-war accounts found in German military archives, indicated that Rommel believed the Allies would attempt their invasion during the next suitable weather window. As the meeting concluded, Eisenhower faced the loneliest moment of command. The decision to proceed or delay rested solely with him, and history would judge the outcome. Outside, English rain continued falling, while across the Channel, German sentries peered through the gloom, unaware that the fate of Europe hung in the balance of a weather forecast. At 0430 hours on June 4, 1944, General Eisenhower made the most consequential decision of his military career. Standing in the lamplit briefing room at Southwick House, surrounded by the Allied High Command, he postponed Operation Overlord by 24 hours. The words came quietly, but carried the weight of nations. We'll go tomorrow. Group Captain Stagg had delivered a revised forecast that offered a narrow window of opportunity. A brief improvement in weather conditions was predicted for June 6th. With clearing skies and reduced wind speeds, it wasn't ideal, but it might be sufficient for the massive undertaking that would determine the fate of Nazi-occupied Europe. The postponement created immediate logistical nightmares. Admiral Ramsey's naval forces had to execute complex maneuvers to recall some convoys, while repositioning others. Ships carrying seasick troops wallowed in heavy seas, their human cargo enduring additional misery while awaiting orders. Radio silence complicated communications, forcing commanders to rely on predetermined protocols and the professional competence of subordinate officers. Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, the original architect of the invasion plan, coordinated the frantic rescheduling efforts. His Cossack organization had spent over a year developing the operational framework, but no amount of planning could have prepared for the chaos of a 24-hour delay. With forces already in motion. At airfields across southern England, paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions endured final equipment checks. Major General Maxwell Taylor's 101st would spearhead the American airborne assault, while Brigadier General James Gavin's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment prepared for their drop behind Utah Beach. These men would be among the first Americans to set foot in occupied France. Jumping in darkness hours before the beach assaults began, the British 6th Airborne Division, under Major General Richard Gale, prepared for equally hazardous missions on the invasion's eastern flank. Lieutenant Colonel Terrence Otway's paratroopers faced the nightmare task of assaulting the Merville Battery, a concrete fortress whose guns could devastate Sword Beach. Intelligence estimates suggested the position was defended by a full company of German troops with interlocking fields of fire. German intelligence remained unaware of the massive force poised to strike. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group West, had dispersed his reserves according to Hitler's explicit orders. The 15th Army remained concentrated around Pas de Calais, convinced by a lie deception that the main attack would come there. Only the 7th Army defended Normandy, and its commander, Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, had scheduled war games for June 6th. Rommel's absence from his command added to German confusion. The Desert Fox had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and planned to meet with Hitler to request additional reinforcements for the Atlantic Wall. His chief of staff, Major General Hans Speidel, commanded Army Group B in his absence, but lacked Rommel's authority to make crucial defensive decisions. Intelligence reports, later documented in captured German archives, revealed the enemy's false confidence. Many German commanders believed the Allies lacked the capability for a major offensive in 1944, expecting any invasion attempt to come in 1945 at the earliest. This strategic miscalculation played directly into Allied hands. At Portsmouth Harbor, hospital ships prepared for the anticipated casualties. Medical personnel, including many volunteers from neutral countries, established casualty clearing stations equipped to handle thousands of wounded. The Red Cross had positioned additional medical supplies throughout southern England, while blood banks prepared for unprecedented demand. The resistance networks across occupied France received their final coded messages through BBC broadcasts. The long sobs of the violins of autumn and other seemingly innocent phrases triggered coordinated sabotage operations designed to disrupt German communications and transportation. French railway workers prepared to disable critical rail lines, while telegraph operators stood ready to cut communication cables. As darkness fell on June 5th, the greatest armada in history prepared for its final approach to the Norman coast. Over 5,000 vessels carrying the hopes of free nations moved through the night toward their destiny in sealed compartments aboard transport ships. Young soldiers wrote final letters home, cleaned their weapons one last time, and tried to sleep before the battle that would determine whether they lived to see another sunset. The weather began clearing as Group Captain Stagg had predicted. Though seas remained rough and winds gusty, it was far from ideal, but it would have to suffice. The liberation of Western Europe could wait no longer, and the forces of freedom prepared to write history with blood and sacrifice on the beaches of Normandy. At 2300 hours, on June 5, 1944, the drone of aircraft engines filled the English sky as the greatest airborne operation in military history commenced. Over 13,000 paratroopers and glider-borne infantry prepared to spearhead Operation Overlord, their mission to secure the flanks of the invasion beaches and create chaos behind German lines. Major General Maxwell Taylor stood in the doorway of his C-47 Dakota, watching the Norman coastline emerge from the darkness below. As commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Taylor carried the responsibility for securing the western approaches to Utah Beach. His screaming eagles would jump into enemy territory with only their personal weapons and whatever supplies they could carry. The flight across the channel proved more harrowing than anticipated. German flak batteries opened fire as the transport formations crossed the coastline, filling the night sky with deadly bursts of anti-aircraft fire. Several aircraft exploded in brilliant flashes, carrying their human cargo to fiery deaths in the Norman countryside. Pilots took evasive action, disrupting the carefully planned formation, flying and scattering paratroopers across a much wider area than intended. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's 3rd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped into a nightmare of confusion and darkness. German machine gun positions, alerted by the aircraft engines, swept the drop zones with interlocking fields of fire. Cole rallied his scattered men using the distinctive cricket calls that identified American paratroopers, but his unit suffered heavy casualties in the first hour after landing. The British 6th Airborne Division faced equally challenging objectives. On the invasion's eastern flank, Major John Howard's company of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry landed their gliders within yards of the Caen Canal Bridge, later known as Pegasus Bridge. Their mission to capture this vile crossing intact succeeded brilliantly, but holding it against German counterattacks would test their resolve throughout the longest day. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway's assault on the Merville Battery exemplified the confusion and heroism that characterized the airborne operations. His carefully rehearsed attack plan disintegrated when transport aircraft, evading flak, scattered his paratroopers across 20 square miles of Norman countryside. Instead of the 700 men planned for the assault, Otway could muster only 150 volunteers. For the attack on the concrete fortress, the Merville Battery assault began at 0430 hours with a coordinated attack by the remnants of Otway's battalion. German defenders, alerted by the earlier parachute drops, had prepared interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach into a killing ground. British paratroopers used Bangalore torpedoes to breach the wire obstacles, but casualties mounted rapidly as they crossed the open ground toward the gun positions. Hand-to-hand fighting raged inside the concrete casemates as British paratroopers overwhelmed the German garrison. Through sheer determination and superior training, Otway's men discovered that intelligence estimates had been incorrect. Instead of large-caliber guns threatening the invasion beaches, the position contained smaller weapons that posed minimal threat to offshore vessels. Nevertheless, the mission was accomplished, and the battery was destroyed using captured German explosives. German response to the airborne landings revealed the confusion that characterized their initial reaction to Operation Overlord. Local commanders received conflicting reports of parachute drops across Normandy, with some dismissing them as supply drops for the French resistance. The German 84th Corps, responsible for defending the Normandy sector, failed to coordinate an effective response during the crucial first hours. Major General Richard Gale, commanding the British 6th Airborne Division, established his headquarters in the village of Ranville, becoming the first Allied general to set foot in occupied France. His paratroopers had secured their primary objectives, including the destruction of coastal artillery positions and the capture of key bridges over the Orne River. However, German counterattacks were building, and reinforcements from the 21st Panzer Division posed a serious threat. Communication failures plagued both sides during the early hours of June 6th. Many paratroop units found their radios damaged during landing, forcing commanders to rely on runners and signal flares to coordinate their scattered forces. German telephone lines, cut by French resistance sabotage operations, left defending units isolated and unable to request reinforcements or artillery support. The airborne operations, despite their confusion and heavy casualties, achieved their primary objective of securing the invasion flanks. German reserves that might have been concentrated against the beach landings were instead dispersed to deal with paratroop units scattered across the Norman countryside. This dispersion of enemy forces would prove crucial when the main invasion force approached the beaches at dawn. As the first gray light of June 6th illuminated the Norman landscape, exhausted paratroopers consolidated their positions and prepared for the German counterattacks that were certain to come. They had paid a heavy price in blood, but their sacrifice had opened the door for the liberation of Western Europe. The longest day was just beginning, and the fate of democracy rested on the shoulders of young men who had voluntarily jumped into the darkness to light the torch of freedom. At 0530 hours on June 6, 1944, the naval bombardment of Hitler's Atlantic Wall commenced with a thunderclap that shook the Norman coastline. Allied warships, from massive battleships to nimble destroyers, unleashed the most concentrated barrage in naval history. The liberation of Western Europe had begun with fire and steel from the sea. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay watched from his flagship as over 200 warships opened fire simultaneously. The British battleships wore Spite and Ramillies, veterans of 2 world wars, hurled 15-inch shells at German coastal fortifications. Their massive guns, each weighing over 100 tons, could penetrate concrete bunkers that smaller weapons could not touch. The American contribution to the naval bombardment was equally impressive. The battleship Nevada, raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor and returned to service. TARGETED German positions at Utah Beach with her 14-inch guns, the Texas and Arkansas, both veterans of the Great War, added their firepower to the devastating barrage that preceded the infantry. Assault. German defenders, shocked by the intensity of the bombardment, struggled to respond effectively. Many coastal artillery positions, built to engage enemy shipping, found their guns unable to depress sufficiently to target the Allied vessels operating close to shore. Those batteries that could return fire faced overwhelming odds, with multiple Allied ships concentrating on each German position. The first wave of landing craft approached the beaches through seas still rough from the previous day's storm. Coxswains, many of them teenagers with minimal experience, fought to keep their vessels on course while seasick soldiers prepared for the assault. The sight of the massive fleet spread across the horizon provided some comfort to men about to face the ultimate test of courage. At Omaha Beach, the naval bombardment proved insufficient against the German defenses. The 15th Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, approached the killing ground that would test their reputation as America's premier assault unit. German positions, largely intact despite the preliminary bombing, commanded overlapping fields of fire across the entire beach area. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, Virginia National Guard, suffered devastating casualties in the first minutes of the assault. German machine guns, positioned in concrete bunkers resistant to naval gunfire, swept the beach with deadly accuracy. The carefully planned assault formation disintegrated under the withering fire, leaving dead and wounded scattered across the sand. Captain John Spaulding's company of the 16th Infantry Regiment found a gap in the German defenses and began moving inland, becoming the first unit to penetrate the Atlantic Wall. At Omaha Beach, his men, using small unit tactics perfected in training, eliminated German positions one by one while other units remained pinned on the beach below. At Utah Beach, the assault proceeded more smoothly due to a fortunate navigation error that landed the 4th Infantry Division in a lightly defended sector. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, personally led the initial assault waves despite being 57 years old and suffering from arthritis and heart problems. His presence on the beach inspired the troops and demonstrated the leadership principles that had made American forces effective. The British and Canadian forces faced their own challenges at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. The 50th Northumbrian Division, attacking Gold Beach, encountered fierce resistance from German positions that had survived the preliminary bombardment. However, their specialized armor, including Churchill-Aver tanks and Sherman DD swimming tanks, provided crucial support that American forces lacked at Omaha Beach. At Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division fought their way ashore against determined German resistance. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifle Regiment, supported by Fort Garry horse tanks, pushed inland more rapidly than any other Allied unit on D-Day. Canadian casualties were heavy, but their advance threatened to outflank German positions. Defending the other beaches, German reaction to the landings revealed the strategic confusion that had plagued their defensive preparations. General Dahlmann, commanding the 7th Army, initially believed the Normandy landings were a diversion, while the main Allied attack would come at Pas-de-Calais. This misconception prevented the immediate commitment of strategic reserves that might have thrown the Allies back into the sea. The 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored unit within immediate striking distance of the invasion beaches, launched a counterattack that briefly reached the coast between Juno and Sword Beaches. However, the division lacked sufficient infantry support and was forced to withdraw when Allied reinforcements arrived. This abortive counterattack represented the best opportunity to defeat the invasion. During its most vulnerable phase. By mid-afternoon, all 5 invasion beaches were secured. Though the situation at Omaha remained precarious, American casualties there exceeded 3,000 men, while the other beaches saw lighter losses. The failure to achieve several D-Day objectives, including the capture of Caen, meant that the campaign would be longer and costlier than originally planned. As darkness fell on the longest day, Allied forces had established a precarious foothold. On the continent of Europe, over 150,000 men had crossed the Channel, with more arriving hourly. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, but the battle for Normandy was just beginning. Hitler's fortress Europe had been cracked, but it would take 11 more months of brutal fighting to complete the liberation. That began on the beaches of Normandy. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy bore witness to both triumph and tragedy. The greatest amphibious assault in human history had succeeded, but at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Over 4,000 Allied soldiers had paid the ultimate price to establish the foothold that would lead to Nazi Germany's destruction. General Eisenhower stood on the deck of a British destroyer, surveying the massive beachhead that his planning had created. Thousands of vehicles, mountains of supplies, and continuous streams of reinforcements flowed across the sand where, hours earlier, young men had died in the surf. The Supreme Commander's gamble had succeeded, but the magnitude of the sacrifice weighed heavily on his conscience. At Omaha Beach, Brigadier General Norman Cota walked among the scattered equipment in silent forms. That marked the costliest battle of D-Day. The 29th Infantry Division had suffered over 2,000 casualties, but their sacrifice had broken the back of German resistance. Survivors, their uniforms still damp with seawater and blood, began the grim task of collecting their dead while preparing for the inevitable German counterattacks. The German High Command struggled to comprehend the scale of the Allied achievement. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, awakened by reports of the invasion, initially dismissed the Normandy landings as a diversionary operation. When the true scope became apparent, he requested permission to commit his strategic reserves, but Hitler remained convinced that the main Allied attack would come at Pas-de-Calais. Rommel's frantic return from Germany highlighted the chaos in German command structure. The Desert Fox, racing across war-torn Europe in his staff car, would not reach his headquarters until evening, too late to coordinate an effective response during the crucial first hours. His absence during the invasion he had predicted and prepared for represented one of history's most significant missed opportunities. The success of Operation Fortitude continued to pay dividends throughout D-Day. German intelligence, thoroughly deceived by Allied deception operations, kept the powerful 15th Army concentrated around Calais, waiting for Patton's fictitious army group. These divisions, if committed to Normandy, might have changed the battle's outcome and prolonged the war by months or years. Behind the beaches, Allied engineers worked frantically to establish the infrastructure necessary to support a massive continental campaign. The Mulberry Harbor's artificial ports towed across the channel in sections would provide the logistical capability to sustain operations until major ports could be captured. This engineering marvel, conceived in the planning rooms of London, proved crucial to maintaining the momentum of liberation. French civilians, emerging from hiding after 4 years of occupation, greeted their liberators with tears of joy and offerings of flowers, wine, and whatever food they could spare. These emotional encounters reminded combat-hardened soldiers why they had crossed the Atlantic to fight in a foreign land. The liberation of France was not merely a military operation, but a moral crusade against tyranny. The airborne forces, scattered and bloodied during their night drops, continued holding crucial objectives despite being vastly outnumbered. Major General Taylor's 101st Airborne Division controlled the western approaches to Utah Beach, while the British 6th Airborne Division maintained their grip on the eastern flank. Their tenacious defense prevented German forces from concentrating against the beach landings. Medical personnel worked around the clock to treat the thousands of wounded scattered across the 5 invasion beaches. Hospital ships, clearly marked with red crosses, evacuated the most serious cases to England, while aid stations established in captured German bunkers provided emergency treatment. The heroism of medics, often unarmed and defenseless, matched that of the combat soldiers they served. The strategic implications of D-Day's success extended far beyond the Norman beaches. Stalin's Soviet Union, which had borne the brunt of fighting Nazi Germany for 3 years, finally had the second front it had desperately requested. German divisions that might have reinforced the Eastern Front would now be needed to defend against the Allied advance from the west. Winston Churchill, monitoring the invasion from his wartime bunker beneath London, understood that D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's regime. The British Prime Minister, who had witnessed his nation stand alone against Nazi tyranny, now saw the forces of democracy poised to liberate Europe. His emotional radio broadcast to the British people captured the moment's significance. The hour of our greatest effort and action has arrived. As reinforcements continued pouring ashore throughout the night, the temporary nature of the Allied foothold began to solidify into a permanent presence. The Wehrmacht had missed its opportunity to drive the invaders back into the sea, and each passing hour brought additional men and equipment that strengthened the Allied position. Operation Overlord had achieved its primary objective of establishing a second front in Western Europe, but the cost had been enormous. The liberation that began on the beaches of Normandy would require 11 more months of brutal fighting, with casualties mounting into the hundreds of thousands. However, the door to Nazi-occupied Europe had been kicked open, and the forces of freedom would not be denied their ultimate victory. The longest day had ended, but the longest campaign was just beginning. Historical context and details in this narrative have been drawn from various sources, including official military histories, personal memoirs of participants, and declassified documents from the National Archives, providing authentic details about Operation Overlord's planning and execution.